setting, and main characters. The scene unfolds in a small, local grocery store located in a quiet neighborhood in the American Midwest. It's a bright and sunny morning, with the kind of crisp air that makes it feel like the start of something new. Inside the store, the usual hustle and bustle fills the air. The sound of shopping carts rolling across the tiled floor, the soft murmur of conversations between shoppers, and the occasional clink of cans being placed on shelves. The store is well lit, with fresh produce neatly arranged in colorful bins, creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere. Shoppers are casually making their way through the aisles, some chatting quietly, others lost in thought as they cross items off their grocery lists. The rhythmic pulse of the neighborhood is apparent, but today something is about to break the flow, and it will come from the unlikeliest of places. A 28-year-old Latino man, tall and athletic, with a quiet confidence about him. Ethan is dressed simply but stylishly in a black jacket and jeans, looking like he could easily blend into any crowd. He's a software engineer who works remotely, enjoying the flexibility that comes with it. Ethan has always been laid back and polite, living a peaceful life, taking pride in his work and maintaining a calm demeanor. He is focused, spending much of his time on his phone as he juggles his personal life with his work commitments. Ethan's calm nature and quiet intelligence make him someone who doesn't stand out in a crowd. Until now. A 75-year-old woman with silver hair that's meticulously pinned into place, wearing glasses that magnify her sharp, intense gaze. She's dressed in an old cardigan, looking like someone who holds tightly to tradition. Cassandra is known in the neighborhood for her stern demeanor and somewhat rigid views on society. She lives alone, having seen and experienced much in her lifetime. Though she carries herself with a quiet authority, there's an air of isolation around her, something that is more pronounced in her harsh judgment of others. She holds conservative beliefs and has a history of keeping to herself, not one for making new friends or changing her ways. The unexpected encounter. It was an ordinary morning for Ethan Rivera as he made his way to the small local grocery store to pick up some essentials. The sun shone brightly through the large windows of the store, casting soft rays across the aisles. Ethan, dressed in his usual black jacket and jeans, walked with ease, his phone in hand as he texted a friend about a recent work project. The soft hum of the store, filled with the sound of carts rolling and shoppers chatting, created a soothing atmosphere. He was focused on his screen, glancing occasionally at the shelves as he walked past the produce section. Ethan's steps took him closer to the fresh vegetables, where a woman, likely in her 70s, stood inspecting apples. She wore a faded cardigan and thick glasses, her silver hair carefully pinned back. Despite the calm ambience of the store, Cassandra Miller, the elderly woman, suddenly felt a rush of irritation. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed Ethan passing by, texting while casually selecting vegetables. To her, something about his presence, his easygoing demeanor, rubbed her the wrong way. It was as if his casual, modern ways didn't belong in the space she had known for so long. She felt a wave of discontent wash over her, and without thinking, turned sharply towards him, her voice rising above the ambient chatter of the store. "You don't belong here," she said coldly, her gaze piercing through him. "Where do you even come from? Mexico, maybe?" The words were out before she could stop them, and a heavy silence fell over the aisle. Ethan froze, his fingers hovering over his phone. He wasn't sure he had heard correctly. For a moment he stood there, stunned by the audacity of her comment. The crowd around them seemed to pause, some shoppers glancing nervously in their direction, while others pretended not to notice. Ethan, taken aback, inhaled deeply, his calm demeanor betraying none of the shock he felt. He didn't immediately react. Instead, he stood still, absorbing the sting of her words, but taking a moment to steady himself. He wasn't sure how to respond just yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't going to be an ordinary grocery trip. The sudden shift in atmosphere. As soon as Cassandra's words hit the air, a heavy silence descended upon the store. The usual sounds of shopping, the clink of cans, the rustling of bags, the soft chatter of nearby customers, faded into nothingness. The atmosphere shifted, thick with tension, as if the entire store collectively held its breath. People stopped what they were doing, unsure whether to intervene or simply walk away. A young mother, who had been browsing the bread aisle with her child, quickly moved her child away, her face a mixture of discomfort and confusion. But even as she tried to walk out of the situation, her eyes lingered on the confrontation, unable to ignore the palpable unease in the air. Cassandra, however, seemed completely unfazed. Her eyes still locked on Ethan, she tightened her grip on her shopping basket and without hesitation continued her verbal attack. "Why don't you just go back to where you came from?" she sneered, her voice rising in anger. "This is our country, not yours. People like you don't belong here." The words hung in the air, sharp and biting. The crowd's discomfort was almost tangible, yet no one moved to challenge her. They were mere bystanders now, trapped in this moment, unsure of how to respond. Ethan stood motionless, still gripping the handle of his basket. His mind raced as he processed the insult. 1,000 thoughts flooded his mind: anger, frustration, disbelief, but none of them prompted an immediate reaction. He could feel his pulse quicken, but he refused to let it control him. Instead of lashing out, he took a deep breath and with incredible restraint met Cassandra's gaze directly. His silence spoke volumes. The intensity of the moment grew heavier as Ethan let her words settle into the air. He was in no rush to respond, allowing the tension to linger. As the crowd waited for something to break the silence, Ethan stood steady, calm and still. His response would come when the time was right, but he wasn't about to let the emotion of the moment dictate his actions. Ethan's statement. After a tense silence that seemed to stretch forever, Ethan made his move. Slowly, he placed his basket on the ground, the sound of it hitting the tile breaking through the thick atmosphere. He straightened his back, standing taller as his calm presence began to fill the space. With deliberate slowness, he turned to face Cassandra, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that matched the weight of her words. "Are you sure you understand what you just said?" Ethan's voice was steady, but the quiet strength behind it made the question feel like a challenge, not an accusation. Cassandra's face flushed, her anger rising in waves. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice trembling with fury. "There's nothing to discuss. People like you don't belong here. This is our country, not yours." Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or step forward. Instead, he took another deep breath, letting the silence settle before he began to speak, his tone calm, but his words packed with weight. "You're right about one thing," he began, his gaze unwavering. "My story does start in Mexico, but that's not the full story. My ancestors, they worked the land. They worked in the mines. They bled for the country you claim as your own." His voice began to carry the weight of history, of struggles past and sacrifices made. "My great-grandfather was an immigrant," he continued. "He walked hundreds of miles, through harsh conditions, just to find a way to survive. He worked his entire life in the fields, helping build this country from the ground up. My father, he didn't get the chance to finish school, but he worked harder than anyone I know, pouring his sweat and blood into every job he could find so that I could have opportunities he never dreamed of." His words echoed through the aisles as the surrounding shoppers watched, the tension in the air palpable. Ethan's voice never wavered, but the story he told carried the weight of generations. "So yes," he said, his eyes still on Cassandra, "I belong here. And I belong more than most because my family built this country with their own hands." Community reaction. As Ethan's words lingered in the air, a profound silence settled over the store. The shoppers who had been casually moving through the aisles now stood still, frozen in place, as the weight of the moment sunk in. Some exchanged glances with each other, while others glanced at Ethan, the intensity of his calm voice reverberating through the space. No one moved. The hum of the refrigerators and the shuffle of shopping carts seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a palpable tension. Cassandra, feeling the pressure of every pair of eyes on her, flushed a deep shade of red. Her hands, which had been gripping her shopping basket tightly, trembled slightly as she tried to gather her thoughts. For a moment she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She glanced around, searching for someone to support her, but the faces of the other shoppers were either averted or locked on her, awaiting her next move. It was clear no one was coming to her defense. The realization began to sink in that she stood alone in her beliefs. Then a voice broke the silence. An older man standing near the dairy section, who had been watching quietly, started to clap slowly. At first the sound was tentative, but then he spoke, his voice ringing through the room. "He's right," he said firmly. "It's time for us to face this kind of discrimination. It has to stop." A young woman standing near the bread aisle nodded in agreement, her eyes bright with emotion. "I'm lucky to have heard those words," she said, her voice full of conviction. "We all need to change, right now. We can't stay silent anymore." The murmurs began to grow louder as more people voiced their support. The atmosphere shifted, no longer heavy with tension, but charged with a sense of collective realization. The moment had changed them, and everyone in the store knew it. Cassandra, standing there, could feel the weight of Ethan's words in the room, and for the first time, she was confronted with the undeniable truth of the impact her words had caused. The change and conclusion. Cassandra, her face flushed with embarrassment and frustration, stood still for a moment, unable to respond. Her chest tightened as she searched for an excuse, a way to deflect the situation, but she found none. The words Ethan had spoken were too powerful, too direct for her to argue against. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the store on her, watching her every move. There was no one to back her up, no voice of support for her views. In that moment, she realized she had lost the battle. Without saying another word, she turned on her heel and walked away, her steps quick and shaky. The air seemed to lighten as she left, the weight of her words dissipating with her departure. The store remained quiet, the crowd still processing what had just happened, but no one attempted to stop her. No one tried to console her or offer an apology on her behalf. She left the store, her head down, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had been exposed. Ethan, however, didn't seek any recognition or applause. He simply picked up his basket, his movements calm and composed, as if the moment had passed. He wasn't looking for validation or praise. This wasn't about him being right or wrong, it was simply about standing up for what was just. He continued his shopping, unaffected by the lingering tension in the air, his mind focused on the next item on his list. As he walked out of the store, a man approached him. The man was older, his face worn with age, but there was a light in his eyes that spoke volumes. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. "What you did in there, it's not easy, but people like you make me believe change is possible." Ethan smiled faintly, nodding in acknowledgement. "It's not about winning or losing," he replied softly. "It's about making sure people hear the truth." The man clasped him on the shoulder, a silent understanding passing between them. As they parted ways, the sense of change lingered in the air, as though the words spoken in that small grocery store had reverberated far beyond its walls. Long-term impact. The story of Ethan's calm yet powerful stand quickly spread throughout the neighborhood, carried on the lips of those who had witnessed it firsthand. People began talking, discussing what had transpired in the grocery store that day. Conversations in local cafes, parks, and workplaces shifted from the usual banter to reflections on the power of words and the responsibility of confronting hate. Many who had remained silent in the past now felt compelled to examine their own biases, slowly starting to reconsider their beliefs about race and inclusion. It wasn't just a simple grocery store confrontation anymore. It had become a catalyst for change within the community. As for Cassandra, though she didn't immediately change, the impact of Ethan's words stayed with her. The days after the incident were filled with internal conflict. She found herself replaying Ethan's story over and over in her mind, the way his voice had never wavered, the powerful legacy of his family that he so calmly shared. The anger she had felt in the moment was replaced by a slow, creeping doubt. In the weeks that followed, Cassandra began to question the beliefs she had held for so long. She could no longer ignore the truth of what she had said and the harm it caused. While she didn't have the courage to seek Ethan out and apologize, she started to reflect on her past actions. She realized her views weren't just outdated, they were wrong. Ethan, meanwhile, wasn't seeking attention or accolades, but his actions had become a quiet inspiration to many. Though he never asked for praise, the community recognized his courage and the dignity with which he handled the situation. People began approaching him, sharing their stories of struggle and resilience. Ethan became a role model for others who wanted to confront injustice with grace. His actions were a lesson in how to patiently and effectively challenge harmful ideologies, and his calm demeanor had sparked a quiet revolution in the way his community thought about race and respect. Through his example, the neighborhood began to heal, one conversation at a time. In today's world, the lesson Ethan taught is one we all need to embrace. Confronting racism and prejudice isn't always about raising our voices in anger. Sometimes it's about standing firm with dignity, speaking calmly, and challenging harmful beliefs with truth. Ethan's response shows us that silence in the face of injustice only allows it to thrive, but speaking up, without hatred or bitterness, can plant the seeds of change. It's not about seeking attention or praise, but about doing what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. In our everyday lives, we encounter moments where we can either choose to ignore prejudice or take a stand. Whether it's in a workplace, at school, or within our own families, challenging harmful stereotypes and speaking out against discrimination can help shape a better, more inclusive society. Change starts with us. Each of us has the power to make a difference, one conversation at a time.